Today in the show, we're going to be talking about DC Comics Crisis series. If you didn't know that a crisis could be as big as a 12-issue, year-long maxi series, or as small as a chapter in Forever Evil, then this show is for you. So you hear the term crisis tossed about like salad in my History of DC videos. Crisis on Infinite Earths, Final Crisis, Infinite Crisis, Crisis in Time, Crisis of Self. And it's come to my attention that very few people know how important each and every crisis is. I also feel like very few people seem to not understand why DC Comics call very few events a crisis. A crisis is not a cool name for an event. DC calls something a crisis when it has to happen. They have no other choice. The reason why a crisis can need to happen can be anything from continuity errors or writers really aren't feeling the current chemistry in the DC universe and they need something to refresh it and add something new to the mix. With the release of Infinity Man and the Forever People, which has high potential to lead into a crisis event, I think it's important for us to talk about a few of the past crisis events. There are three reoccurring themes across the board for the crisis events, although not all of these are in every single crisis. There's usually a threat to existence itself or the heroes of the DC universe. There is always huge consequences, without a doubt. There is always going to be huge consequences. Multiple universes is definitely a staple on the crisis storylines. However, they're not always necessary, but that is what got the crises started. So clearly, with the three of those in the mix together, they're very fun, relaxed stories that you can just flip through. The term crisis was first used in 1963 and was used until 1985 to describe the annual event in which Earth 1 and Earth 2 would work together. And in each one of these annual events, more of the DC multiverse was established. They stopped using the term crisis like this in 1985 due to Crisis on Infinite Earths. You see, Crisis on Infinite Earths totally got rid of the DC multiverse. Crisis on Infinite Earths will probably take up the majority of this video with good reason. It's a huge thing to talk about, and we're not even going to be talking about the main story of it today. The important thing for you to take note of is that Crisis on Infinite Earths for the time was huge. Even for now, it's huge. But back in the 80s, comic book storytelling was really compressed. Usually a crossover lasted about 1 to 5 issues, nothing more than that. Anything more than that would have been insane and out of the question. And DC went ahead and did it. After Crisis on Infinite Earths, the term crisis began to be used to describe a huge event in the DC universe that totally changed the chemistry of everything. For example, Identity Crisis. While Identity Crisis didn't have much, if anything, to do with the DC multiverse, it definitely totally changed the chemistry in the DC universe. And then Final Crisis and Infinite Crisis came along, re-established the DC multiverse, and made things like Kingdom Come canon in their own self-contained universe. This allowed for potential characters from parallel universes, such as Dula Dent of Earth 3, to cross over into the main universe. This particular nuance is important because there is a multiverse in the New 52 at the moment, and the New 52 is actually set somewhere after Infinite Crisis, but somewhere before Final Crisis, which means the potential for Final Crisis to happen again is still there. Honestly, Crisis on Infinite Earths is the reason we still have DC Comics to this day. And not only that, it was mid-80s to early 90s DC. That was the best time for DC Comics. So with that being said, let's get on to the details of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Like I said, we'll probably spend the most time on this crisis in this video, but we are going to cover 2 others. We're also not getting too in-depth with the story because the story is so huge, I really want to give it its own video. So I hope you can understand that. So Crisis on Infinite Earths was originally just supposed to be a simple event to celebrate 50 years of DC Comics. But Marv Wolfman, the writer of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and the writer for the new Teen Titans back in the 1980s decided that this would be a good opportunity to clear up DC's continuity, because it was bad. Admittedly, DC have always been kind of iffy when it comes to their own continuity, but back in the 1980s and before then, they were especially bad, particularly with Batman and Superman. When it came to Superman, Superman originally came from a planet with stronger gravity than Earth, which gave him super strength, but he couldn't fly. But then flying was added to the mix. But then a link to the sun was added to the mix. Things really got out of hand when Krypton was added to the mix, because then Supergirl was added to the mix, then exploits under the name Superboy was added to the mix, and then Krypto the Superdog was added to the mix, but Superman was still the lone survivor of his original planet. And it was mentioned a lot that he was this lone survivor, even though Krypto and Supergirl were right there. Now when it came to Batman, back then characters without any powers tended to age somewhat in real time, which was a huge issue for Batman. It was an issue because Batman was around in World War II. He fought Hitler, but he hadn't aged a day since World War II. And then Robin took over 30 years to finish high school. Considering these two weren't supposed to have any powers, this really wasn't good. Not to mention the fact that characters like the Flash, the Atom, Green Lantern tended to have different origins and powers depending on the writers, which led to a lot of plot holes. Again, not good. Then don't even get me started on the issue regarding the multiverse. Writers began to forget which universe which character was from, and there was a bunch of crossing over totally unintentionally. So you get the idea. Things were crazy, they were messed up, and they needed to be fixed. So when it came to planning this event, they needed to figure out first which characters were actually from the mainstream DC universe. And then all the editors at DC and a number of writers had meetings to plan out how this was going to go down. And these meetings went over the course of a year. The funny thing about this event is that it did incredibly well. It made DC stamp on the 80s permanent. You cannot deny that it's possibly one of the most successful events to this day. The funny thing is, and I found this out, there was no posters, no flyers, no handouts, and there was hardly any ads in existing comics. The reason this event was so good was because the writing and the creativity and the storytelling was so on point, and it made DC Comics realize they have to focus on the creative side of things and not the commercial side of things, which is what I think DC needs at the moment. After Crisis on Infinite Earths, a few characters were added, a few characters were taken away, and a number of characters had totally new origins. Think of it a bit like the 80s New 52, only more justified. However, it is worth saying that this event didn't fix everything. There were still some persisting continuity issues. Now on to Identity Crisis. You'll be happy to know that this event had a number of repercussions, but it was nowhere near as big as Crisis on Infinite Earths. Identity Crisis to this day is one of DC's best-selling events. The whole storyline of this basically goes something along the lines of someone, and we don't know who, is attacking family members of the heroes that we love. But there's this whole subplot involving the Justice League and how one time they wiped Batman's mind to make him forget the fact that Zatanna was basically giving Dr. Light a lobotomy. The main repercussions of this event was that the Justice League couldn't trust each other anymore, which meant for a kind of crappy Justice League. Batman sets up a satellite to watch all superpowered beings on Earth at all times, and Tim Drake's father gets killed. There are many levels to this event, and it will definitely get its own video before summer's end, because this year, in fact this month, is the 10th year anniversary of Identity Crisis. Now we're on to Infinite Crisis, which is a direct sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths. However, it's also part of Final Crisis, so it will also get its own video eventually. Infinite Crisis brought back the multiverse to the DC universe. It made things that fans thought were totally non-canon, totally canon, and able to interact with the mainstream DC universe. This event was very hard for me to read, and I'm sure it'll be very hard for some of you to read, not because you'll have a hard time understanding or anything, but because Superboy Prime always ruins everything. I love Connor Kent, I love Tim Drake, and I love Bart Allen as Impulse. Those three characters were always there when I was growing up. They're really the icons of the 90s for myself. The main thing that kind of ruined this event for me is that, right, Superboy is spending a night with Cassie right before he's called away by Nightwing, and the two of them mention how it's potentially their last night together. And it's also worth mentioning that Cassie is Wonder Girl, and because of Infinite Crisis, she is losing her powers. Superboy goes off to help Nightwing, and then Superboy Prime comes along and attacks Nightwing, so Superboy attacks Superboy Prime, so the two Superboys are in a giant battle, and it's not really clear who's going to win. And then in the fight, Superboy pushes Superboy Prime into Alexander Luthor's multiversal tower, thus saving the Earth from being erased. And then Superboy is laying there with heroes surrounding him, with Cassie clutching him, and Cassie goes, "You saved the world, Connor," and Connor goes, "I know, Cass, isn't it cool, right?" And then he dies. And the worst part of all of this is that the Titans already saved him from dying just a few issues ago. Now it is worth saying that he would be resurrected along with Bart Allen in Final Crisis, The Legion of Three Worlds. So what you can gather from the Crisis events is that there's a lot of planning in each and every one of them, and they're all fantastic. They all tend to involve death of characters that you love, and sometimes those characters don't come back. The main goal for this video was for all of you to understand just how big and how important Crisis events are, and I really hope I got that message across. I've already done a video on Final Crisis in which I go into detail in the story, so if you want information on Final Crisis, please click the link down below. It's super effective! Okay guys, that is it for today. If you think I missed anything important about any of the mentioned Crisis events, please let me know in the comments down below. And also don't forget to thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more history, and also don't forget to support the show by checking out my Patreon, like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, and subscribe to my gaming channel. My name is Faust, this has been Exploring Comics, and it is super effective.